Hello. As people join in, how about you drop a chat, generally where you're coming from. You don't have to dox yourself, but you know, if you want to get geographically ambiguous, and share where you're from. Hey, Vincent. Glad you can make it. We have a few people, a few more minutes. I expect this to be really small. I mean, the people that I've been to on their live sessions, have like 400,000 subscribers, and they'll get 20, 30 people on a live show. So I'm under no delusions that with my 5,000 subscribers that we'll get 20 or 30 people. I think I was expecting two or three, to be honest. um, and also we have the weird time zone stuff because I tend to um, have a very split following, which is actually something I take a little bit of pride in. That it's not this wholly like sort of American centric type of channel. Maybe because most of like not I shouldn't say most. Some of my most experienced mentors came out of more of like European schools of climbing, where they learned to climb. So I tend to think of things a little bit that way. So for what it's worth. Given that this is being recorded, um, I thought I would go into, and if it's an event of being just you and me, then this is going to be pretty informal. But obviously, it's going to be recorded, and people can go look at it afterwards. And so I've been gathering questions over social media. I think you contributed a couple to a couple different spots, or maybe just the YouTube community page. So I was going to go through those questions first. I have 11 of them. I tried to put them in some sort of coherent order so that they'd flow. And then once we get through those questions that people had already submitted, so that again, when people come back and view this after the fact, they can hopefully see that I took them seriously and tried to answer what they had to say. Then we can open up again to any other broader range of questions. So for those who are just joining, if you want to follow Vincent's lead there in the chat, and I'm not asking for specific locations because in today's world that sounds dangerous. But if people want to type in where they're generally joining us from, that would be great. Bill Clinton. Oh my gosh. I thought he was in the hospital. Good recovery. All right. So yeah, those predetermined questions. The one that people had already typed in on the community pages. Again, trying to put them in some sort of flow, not necessarily the order that they came in. I started out, I got a few questions about stoves. I think it's because I posted some community page stuff about stoves, and so it put it top of mind for some folks. So I'll continue with that and do the stove ones first, and then sort of work through some other gear questions, and then it gets into my own preferences about stuff, and then eventually gets into bigger think type of questions around, what is it like to do this stuff with kids, and what am I learning about that, and all those types of things. So that's where we'll go, and then like I was saying, we'll open it up for other questions as well. And this is going to be so small that if you guys want to follow up with just typing in additional stuff in the chat as I go for it. So the first question I'm going to take on is like, do I use alcohol stoves? No, I don't. I don't use alcohol stoves. Very common in the backpacking world, and particularly the ultralight backpacking world. Um, I think mostly because I come from a mountaineering background. I do not. Um, I know they've gotten better, but I don't follow the alcohol stove world particularly closely, um, because I find them to be potentially messy and kind of space consuming. Like you really need flat surface available to use them effectively. You're pouring alcohol into things unless you're doing a pellet stove and all that type of stuff. And from a mountaineering perspective, certainly most of the time you're kind of like sitting near your tent or in your vestibule and cooking on something that's pseudo flat, but you kind of always have to be ready to be cooking in a gale, in which case you're closing up the tent and you're hanging things from your tent. And so if it's not hangable, I'm not doing it. And then as soon as you're pouring liquids in that type of environment, that gets really dangerous too, which is why you don't see even white gas, which we know performs better in the cold. Typically in high altitude places, you're going to be seeing canister things. Um, no, I haven't. They have their place. This just doesn't happen to be my place. um, and then with same kind of following from that, a question about vaporized tubes and remote canister stoves. So it looks like a white gas stove. You've got the fuel line running from the stove to a canister. Oftentimes that canister can invert, which is like sort of the whole point, is to get the canister to invert so that it's flowing through the fuel line as liquid, and then it's getting vaporized at the source of the stove. Yes, I absolutely have. In fact, you're going to be seeing a couple of videos coming out in weeks to a month, where I'm talking about hanging kits for those types of stoves. Again, needing to be able to hang being important for the type of climbing that I sometimes do. And so I don't tend to buy stoves that I can't hang or figure out how to hang. So you'll be seeing some stuff about that. That stuff's been going on since, like Steve House was a big advocate of a remote canister stove when he was doing, really cutting edge, um, light and fast alpinism, in order to get that benefit in the cold weather environments that he was in from an inverted canister. So it's been around for a while, and the stoves have been getting better. And it's not my go-to because I'm not often in an environment that's that extreme. Um, so just sort of like making do um, with a regular, canister, keeping the canister in my jacket until it's time to use it, making sure it goes in my sleeping bag overnight if I'm cooking next morning is usually fine. But absolutely, like if things are going to get truly cold, or if I'm going to be doing something that's really hard, then yeah, I'll go ahead and use a. I happen to use the Optimus Vega as my remote canister stove, but there are other options that are equally as good. Um, and sort of a follow-up question to that was, do I think they're going to replace liquid fuel stoves? Like, absolutely not, right? Like, white gas is still going to do better in the cold. And for people who are doing more, base camp based climbing, make a central camp, and then maybe, doing different routes coming out of that base camp, which is oftentimes what I'm doing in like where I live in Colorado. If I'm not having to, again, manage that hanging kit that is possible to do, but a lot more complicated to make with a liquid fuel stove. Yeah, then might as well bring a liquid fuel stove because it's going to work better in the cold, sitting on snow at a base camp kind of thing. And, the universal availability of liquid fuels, particularly if you're getting like the Whisper Light Universal from MSR, where it can use different fuels, that's going to be easier to get to in some places where maybe canisters are unavailable. But again, when you start getting into like really complex alpine environments, and particularly high altitude, like I know it's sort of counterintuitive, but I get a lot of this like, no one uses canister in the cold. Well, that's absolutely not true. Canisters are less efficient in the cold, but the convenience of that packaging that becomes a safety benefit when you're having to hang stoves in your tent is unmatched, because you do not want open flame around a highly flammable tent, let it be nylon or Dyneema or whatever else you're making it out of. So yeah, I don't think liquid stoves are going away by any stretch. That they'll always have their place because they're sort of like the workhorse truck of the stove world. You get the the fast Ferraris and all that kind of thing. But, a liquid, a white gas or a liquid fuel stove, an XGK that can burn, like crazy and boil a bunch of water for a team of 8. Like that stuff's going to always be around. And then I think I got a specific question, actually from you, Vincent, kind of going with the stove stuff about why I had, let's see here. You're talking about the MSR reactor. Well, I was talking about the MSR reactor. And do I just use it? And then like why I had a Joule pot. I think it's from a photo that you saw. It's actually just because I have the Joule pot. Like I did have I guess I still do. I still have a Jetboil Joule. They don't make it anymore. So it's not available. It's an inverted canister stove that sits in a vertical orientation rather than horizontally like a remote canister. I took one of those to Denali and it actually sort of failed, not like completely failed, but it performed very poorly. And there is that sort of difficulty of just plain old gravity. You turn the canister upside down and it's underneath the stove and you're pumping liquid to try to get up to the burner. You're just fighting gravity. And so I think between that and the weight, Jetboil stopped making it. But, having an insulated 2-liter pot, in this particular case, I was setting up a stove to go out with a family of 4. So we're going to melt a lot of snow and turn it into water. Might as well use a 2-liter pot. And then, if I'm family camping and I'm hauling in a sled, I'm not that concerned about weight. And so having an insulated pot, sure, it's going to be better if I don't care about the weight penalty. And so I happen to have a Joule pot on that stove at the time. But the way the hanging kit's set up, as you'll eventually see in that video, is I can use all sorts of different pots on it. That just happen to be what I have. The MSR reactor, back to your question, Vincent, it's still the kind of the best at turning snow into water. It does that incredibly efficiently, even compared to newer and newer stoves. That's why you see so much of it, is that, in the Alpine world, and, if you're only doing freeze dried, you're not doing any type of cooking. And so you're only making water either to drink or to pour into your meals. It absolutely is still one of the standards out there, but you're seeing less and less of it amongst, the really cutting edge alpinists, because it doesn't burn that clean. It's not an inverted canister. And so you get that weird, it burns off the easy fuel first and then the propane stays, and that makes a dirtier burn. And if you're inside a tent, you don't want a dirtier burn. And so you're not going to see it so much when people are doing, really big alpine climbs. Like I think in that video where I start talking about canisters and remote canisters and all that type of stuff, I pull in 2 clips. One was from the movie Meru. One was from Cold, which was, why am I blanking on his name? He's like all over the news right now. The Winter Ascent of Gasherbrum 2 with Simone Morrow and Corey Richards. And I can't remember the other guy. Anyway, another really renowned high altitude climber, but they're in as cold a place as they could be, 8,000 meters in the middle of winter. They were using a Jetboil, and so was Meru. They were using a Jetboil. Now, granted, that was a while ago. That was 2011, 2013, but the MSR reactor existed then, and they weren't using it. And it gets down to sort of how clean that fuel mixture ends up being when it's not performing well. It's fine points, but when people are doing stuff that hard, they care about the fine points. So I use the reactor a lot. I very rarely hang with it. If I'm bringing a non-inverted canister and I'm going to hang it, I actually tend to use the Jetboil Minimo, which is a 1.5 liter pot, just like the reactor. It's a little bit wider, but it's a lot more squatty. And so it also has an insulated wrap around the pot. It doesn't perform maybe quite as well as the reactor if the reactor is performing its best. But I find the reactor, and I did a video about stove performance in mildly cold temperatures quite a while ago, and did graphs and charts and all that type of stuff. And the MSR reactor was like wildly inconsistent when it got into environments where it doesn't perform its best, and particularly cold environments. Like it would shoot off a boil in under a minute, but then like the next time it would take 5. And you're just like, why? What happened? What's different? And the Minimo is a very consistent high performer. And so I tend to bring that along, and its squatty nature makes it a little bit less voluminous to put in a pack. So that tends to be my go-to if I'm going to be hanging a non-inverted canister. So that's a lot about stoves. And I'm seeing your follow-up questions, Vince. I do have something talking about fitness, so I'll come to your uphill athlete one in a little bit. And start the channel towards the end of these prepped questions, these previewed questions. People start getting into a bit more of that, like inside your head, deeper think stuff. So I'll come to that too. Thanks for dropping stuff in the chat. So still talking about gear. There was another question about my thoughts on, persistent chemicals, PFAS stuff, microplastics, and whether or not I think, or I guess it was just sort of asked open-endedly, like, what are my thoughts on PFAS and how that chemical or lack of chemicals are going to proceed through the outdoor, particularly garment community. Obviously, water bottles and stuff, they've been trying to pull that stuff out for a while, although there's still problems with it. And I guess my thoughts are like real, like this, like, it was sort of painted as the question sort of painted as, so are we going to like regress back to old styles of clothing that were serviceable, but then were sort of replaced by Gore-Tex and those types of more modern chemically treated fabrics. And we're already seeing companies like Patagonia come up with new stuff that they're claiming is PFAS free. I don't have any reason to not believe them that it really is, but they're saying it's not. Like, I'm not going to doubt that. I just take a more, like, it'll be something else, right? If you sort of march through the 1970s to now in the progression of science around chemicals that we apply to consumer goods, and then we figure out 25 years later are bad for us. Teflon would be a classic example. It used to be on all the pots and pans to make them nonstick, and now they can't do it because it's truly, honestly, really bad for you. Like, and now people are starting to learn, like right now, that it's as much as microplastics, which is a scientific definition of a size of the plastic, is a problem. Nanoplastics, which are even smaller, is actually a bigger problem, and they leach even more readily from things like plastic water bottles with heated water in it and things like that. Like, yeah, we'll get rid of PFAS chemicals, and companies like Gore-Tex will figure out alternatives to that and remove that. And then we will find that whatever else they put in it will do some other kind of damage to ourselves and the environment. And that doesn't mean that I'm fatalistic or nihilistic about it. Like, oh, well, then we shouldn't care. I just think it's one of those things, like, shoot for perfection, realize you're never going to get there. And it's the long march of human progress, right? That, yes, we know that this is bad. We are actively, as an industry, not that I'm any part of the industry, so I shouldn't say we, they're actively removing this thing that they now know is bad, as they should. And then something else bad will happen, either through whatever they replace it with, or just because our science and our ability to detect toxic and poisonous things will continue to improve. We'll find something else that isn't good, and then it will be ethically responsible to now that remove that. And so I just sort of see this as a hopefully, like the long arc of progress, it bends, as the paraphrased Martin Luther King quote, it bends towards justice. Like, hopefully this long arc of progress, we continue to get more and more refined, and so the dangers get less and less and less. But I don't expect the danger to ever go away. It'll just be a new set of dangers that are hopefully less immediately harmful. So that's my thoughts, for whatever it's worth. Not that I have a crystal ball that's better than anyone else's, and I don't make gear, so there's probably people who are more qualified than I to talk about that. But it's sort of like the cost of doing business for me. It's like, well, we accept objective hazards when we go into the mountains. I'm willing to accept a certain amount of hazard, from whether or not my water bottle is leaching chemicals into me when I put warm water into it and drink it on a snowy camp. Like, as long as I'm conscious that I'm doing that, and I modulate how much of that, to the best of my ability, I'm doing, then, as you guys know, I have cancer, not because of chemicals in my clothing, but I have a blood cancer. And like, one of the things that my oncologist told me is that, we're all going to die of cancer. and she's sort of saying that tongue in cheek, but the reality is that, it's not so much that everyone is getting cancer more, it's that we're able to detect it so much better. And so I think that's kind of what's going to happen. Next question. How do I balance wind resistance, condensation, pack size, all that sort of stuff when I choose a tent for fast and light, and what tent am I using? I'm using the Samaya Ultra 2 for fast and light. Not that fast and light is, always what I'm doing. In fact, it's kind of rarely what I'm doing, seeing I spend most of my time with my kids, and that'll get into the question um, about learning with my kids and sort of the stuff around that dynamic. But when I'm out like doing stuff for myself and I'm trying to cut weight and cut pack size, and yeah, I'm using a Samaya. It's the best stuff out there. Um, I know, there's a certain amount of privilege, frankly, at the price point of Samaya's products that come with that. It's not, I bought it. I buy all my stuff. No one's sending me free things. My day job is working in healthcare analytics, and so I'm fortunate in that way. 20 years ago, that was a job description that showed up on the cover of Time magazine. The future of healthcare is in analytics, and I happened to land there. So there's a certain amount of like just luck that came with that, so I can afford things like that. And so I know that's not an option for everyone, but because I can afford things like that, and because certainly my big expeditions that I don't do that often, but even a winter climb is still if you get hurt on a winter climb, even here in Colorado, it's going to take 10 hours for search and rescue to come get you, and so dying of exposure is like a real, it's like it's a thing. It can potentially happen. So if stuff's life threatening, I'm going to attempt to get the best gear I can find for the type of climbing that I'm doing at the time. And so if I'm going to try and balance all those things that this question was asking about, yeah, I go with the Samaya tent right now because that's what it's designed to do. Hey, Greg, thanks for joining us. If you're willing to drop in, generally where you're, sorry, you're late. Well, I knew it was going to be, as I was saying early when it was just Vincent and me, like I knew this was going to be a small group. Like, I was saying, channels that I follow that have like 500,000, 400,000 subscribers, they'll get 20, 30 people in a live chat. So with 5,000, like I'm very happy to have this kind of intimate conversation. So if you want to drop kind of generically, without putting too specifics in social media, kind of where you're coming in from, Craig, that would be cool. We're going through a list of questions that people sent ahead of time, and then we're kind of going to open it up after that. I'm not always trying to go with the lightest. There are times I'll go with a double wall tent because I just don't want to deal with the condensation. But then I'm consciously making the trade-off of like, okay, I'm not going the lightest. And so it's probably not a fast and light mission. I try to tailor the gear to the trip, which again is a fairly advantageous position to be in. A lot of people need to find that gear that they can do many things with. And we know that as soon as you get a piece of gear that you can do many things with, then we know it's not the best at something, right? Anything that is a quiver of many is not tailored to a specific thing. Just look at ice tools, right? And how much curve in the neck is sort of going to dictate how steep the ice it can climb. If you're climbing WI 2 and 3, you actually don't want an aggressive tool because you'll find that the beak of the pick is already kind of pointed down and back towards you by the time it hits the low angle ice, and like you actually can't even get it in the ice even though you have this Ferrari of an ice tool. Just one example, right? And so you can't as soon as you tailor something for steep pillared ice, then you're going to have a curve on it in order to do that. And once you have that curve on it, it's no longer a generalist tool. It literally won't work on low angle ice. So anytime you get sort of the workhorse piece of gear, it's not going to be the best at something. And so I don't have the best of something for everything. That's for certain. But to the extent like within my means that I can tailor a piece of gear to a particular trip, and you think about sort of the big expenses, sleeping bags, tents, those types of expensive pieces of equipment. Those are places where I will try to dial it a little bit more. Because it is very life dependent, pieces of gear. I know a lot of people in the climbing world and climbing channels are very, very concerned about, the technical climbing equipment. Is is the Adoroid pinch better than the Gree? And if so, how so? And there are going to be trade-offs between the two, and I think that's a really worthwhile discussion. But I'm more concerned about sort of the survivalist aspects of it, because I think it's more of a mountaineering background, and I came to technical climbing through mountaineering and not the other way around. And so I tend to think more about tents and sleeping bags and things like that, because I spend so much time on big mountains. You're just sitting. You're not always I'm not Steve House, and as much as I train, I'm never going to be one of those people. I'm 48 with asthma and with blood cancer. I'm never going to do a 72-hour no sleep push, and so I don't need to worry about what I'm sleeping on. Like, no, I'm going to be sitting on the mountain for a while, and so I need to think about surviving in that environment. So kind of moving on, favorite piece of gear. That's a tough one. Like, it's such an apples to oranges to grapes to mangoes type of comparison. Yeah, it's, on one way I could answer it, like, what do I just grab most frequently? And what I grab most frequently for, when I'm not just out with the kids doing, something very tailored to them, but if I was climbing for myself, I think I probably grab my Hyperlight Prism pack the most. I just throw it on. I did a review of that not too long ago, and that was one of the points I made. Like, what rings in my head of like, oh, you must really like this gear, is the fact that I don't think about grabbing it. I just grab it. I was like, oh, well, if I stop and I, sort of do a meta conversation with myself, like, what's the stuff that you don't even think about? You just pull off your gear rack. That's one of the things. Because I like ice and mixed climbing so much, which we'll get into a question next, my ice tools, I like them a lot. And I have, again, based on, the conversation I was just talking about earlier, I have, different ones. Like I really love, I just got at the end of last ice season, I just got some Morphos from Elite Climb. And obviously, like, those are steep tools. And so I'm not always on steep stuff, particularly when I'm climbing with my kids. But if I get on steep stuff, it's night and day for me. Like, I like my camp extremes, but being able to go carbon fiber, which makes it a little lighter over my head, makes it less conductive of the cold seeping through the shaft. I really like those Morphos quite a bit. Up until last year, I was climbing on my extremes all the time. I love the versatility of those. That might fall into more of that workhorse category, because it has the adjustable grip angle, so that you can use it for ice or for dry, as long as you're willing to swap out the pick. Had that for years. Love those. And so just because that falls into styles of climbing that I really enjoy, I find ice and mix to be way more fun for me than rock. I'm marginal at all of it, but I'm the most marginal at rock, which I'll describe a little bit about in the next question here, why that is. So maybe my tools. And then I love my Patagonia grade 7 down jacket, which is, expedition worthy, 7,000, low 8,000 meter peak worthy type jacket. So again, it's not something I'm going to pull on all the time like a Prism pack, but if I go into those types of environments, the functionality with the 4 drop pockets in the coat and the 2 chest pockets when you're really dealing with cold weather stuff, and you got to keep everything liquid, including food, with just a little bit of water in it, because almost all food has even just a little bit of water. You need to put everything in your pockets. You need to carry fuel canisters in your pockets. It's unelegant for sure, but just having that amount of like body warmth storage capacity around you all the time, and then it's super light. You pay for that jacket. They don't, it's not a cheap jacket, but I love that thing. It's really great. Which then does lead into the next question, like, what's my favorite style of climbing? It's not the climbing I do the most, but I do like ice and mixed, and particularly mixed. It's the right I find ice to be meditative. Like, if you're just thinking about like pure vertical ice, I find it to be very meditative. And those of you who do any ice climbing kind of know that when you're not trying to, deal with terrain differences and features, if it's a very uniform set of ice, it becomes this very methodical type of climbing in terms of using proper technique, throwing the tool up and then hanging on it and then getting your hips out of the way so you can move up your feet, getting your feet level, sucking your belly in, arching back, making your next throw. It's this very monotonous, some people would say, but I find very meditative type of climbing, and I sort of enjoy that. But then obviously rock, the opposite end is a puzzle, and the features are going to dictate your holds much more. And mixed is sort of the combination of those two things. There's moments of both, and I think that's part of why I like it so much. Yeah, I don't know. Rock climbing I wrestle with because I've done my right ACL 3 times. So like if there's a high right foot on rock, I'm just screwed. It's like I got to find alternate beta because I have such a hard time doing a rock over onto my right side, or doing a heel hook that's worth anything on my right side. I can do it on my left, but it's really difficult. And so there's certain climbs out there that I just, and then also I'm 5'6", so I'm not a tall person. And so you start throwing in those combinations, and there's some rock climbs that are just difficult for me. And then, like I said, I sort of came to technical climbing through the mountaineering channel. My first technical climbing ever was actually on ice, like truly vertical technical. My wife got me some lessons way back when with a guide, down in Uray, Colorado, which is where the ice park is. And, first time I ever like really roped up in a consequential environment was ice climbing. And so I kind of fell to that first. I came to rock later. But then I came to rock after, getting all these knee injuries. It just became difficult. And so, I don't have the requisite, like my fingers are like, okay. Like I actually crimp fairly well, mostly because I'm small. And so I have smaller hands. But, I'm not one of those people who's like, yeah, I started climbing like my kids started climbing before they could walk. I don't have all those body adaptations that a lifetime of rock climbing will do and make rock climbing easier for you. So Mix finds that happy tool. I'm carrying the jug of the tool up with me everywhere I go, but it's enough of a puzzle. Like rock climbing is, and use the term problem. It's a problem. The terrain is dictating stuff. So I think it's a good blend. Just checking in on the UK based Craig, indoor climbing. Cool. Thanks, Craig, for telling us a little bit about yourself and Quebec. Yes. Well, absolutely. Try ice climbing in Quebec. I haven't yet, but I'm very aware that it's one of the, the epicenters of ice climbing, in the world. I have visited Quebec just in the summer. We actually spent, it's one of the more, personally fulfilling trips. Had nothing to do with climbing. It was a family get together, me and my wife and my kids, my brother and his wife and his kids, my parents, we all converged on Quebec Island, just outside of Quebec City on what is it? It's what's the name of it? Isle d'Orleans, outside Quebec City. It turns out that I have Polish and French ancestry. My French side were among the founders of Quebec City. So I do have there you go. Your chat just caught up. Isle d'Orleans. Thank you. So I actually have, ancestral ties to Quebec. Not that I've spent a lot of time there, but hopefully we will spend some more time there because of that now. But it was we were there in the middle of summer and we did strawberry picking and, things with like little, the kids were little, they were 3.5 or something like that. And I think it was right before I got diagnosed with cancer, actually. So it was probably the summer of 2018 that we were out there. So anyway, thanks for joining us from Quebec. And yes, it is on my list to do some ice climbing out there. All right, so we went through favorite piece of gear. We talked about whether or not I prefer rock, snow, or ice. Okay, where am I? That was 7, 8. Physical fitness for ice climbing. Got a question from someone who's just starting ice climbing, and they're basically doing bouldering, and I assume sort of like gym bouldering, and doing some ice laps on top rope. And they're asking like, what else would you do to get fit? And there's as many opinions as there are people, and maybe this is where I can lead in also to the uphill athlete question that you asked, Vincent. Yes, I do subscribe to the uphill athlete. I work through a number of their training programs. I read the book when it first came out. This must have been 2017 or 2016 or something like that. they have training programs for the ice climbing question that you can follow. Beginner to ice climbing, beginner to mixed, intermediate ice climbing, intermediate to mixed. I follow those. If I were to not linger on that question for too long and try and steal all the intellectual property from Steve House and his company, I would say that maybe the thing that's overlooked, particularly for beginner ice climbers, because sort of by definition, you're not going to be on straight vertical ice all the time. You're going to be climbing WI2, you're going to be climbing WI3, is just the same way on vertical rock that when you get to vertical and overhanging, you're going to be reliant more on your grip strength, and you're not going to feel it in your calves. If you compare it to slab on rock, you're going to feel it in your calves. Same thing on low angle ice, is you're going to feel it in your calves. And so the likelihood that you are going to get calf burn to the point where maybe even that's the thing that makes you stop, because you aren't hanging in a vertical environment very long while you're placing screws. You're more reliant on your base. I would recommend making sure you do, various forms of calf raises and, progressive overload of adding weight to calf raises, whether that's through a vest or holding your weights. And then, the other variable in calf raises that you can change besides adding weight or repetition is how much of your foot is on the edge. So if you start, if we call this my foot, and that's the ball of my foot here is my first knuckles, you can start there when you have your whole ball of your foot and you're doing, calf raises, and you can start to move that out. You can move that all the way out even to front pointed crampons, where, now you're doing a lever effect on the front. And the more you move that fulcrum away from the ball of your foot, the harder those calf raises are. And then the other thing I would say is there's really two styles of calf raises. There's straight leg calf raises that work I think it's the outside calf muscle. And then there's bent knee, where you're in a squat, calf raises, which work the inside muscles. I think it's the soleus, if I'm not mistaken. Do both. So that would be sort of my generic, look at Steve House's stuff. It's really good. Uphill Athlete is the name of the company. You can buy training plans, and once you buy them, you own them forever. It's not a subscription model, so it's kind of affordable that way. I would first go there, but then in just terms of like, I'm a beginning ice climber, what am I not thinking about? What I find most people aren't thinking about when they do ice climbing as beginners is that necessary calf strength, because you're on lower angle stuff. Oh yeah, I think it was, Craig. I think that was your question. So hopefully that helps. And if you have follow-ups, drop them in the chat. All right, so that was the ice climbing one. Okay, so now we're moving away from, oh yeah, we did have one more. No, we are getting into more of the lifestyle and climb inside my head, if you dare kind of questions, which actually I think are fun. The first one was, how do I manage time, family and work, shooting videos, all that type of stuff. Where do I want to start with answers to that? I think there's two major components. The first major component is that I'm an early to bed, early to rise person. And so my most productive hours are first thing in the morning. Excuse me. That's when I do my workouts. If I need to, do some dedicated, short guys beta works time, I'll often do that, after the workout. And then I get into the routine of, I got taking my kids to school. I do the morning, my wife does the afternoon drop off from school, and then I'm in my work day at that point. But what I had found, even prior to kids, but especially after kids, is that the daylight hours end up not being my own, fire drill at work, oh, everyone drop your thing for this analytic emergency, as if there was such a thing. But, I thought I was going to have time in the evening, then I don't, because there's a urgent deliverable, or, as soon as my kids start needing time and attention and that type of thing, as they should, then my attention has to turn towards them. So if there are things that I need to do that are like just for me, like for example, working out, I do those, kind of before everyone wakes up. It's sort of my gift to myself, that people talk about pay yourself first by putting money in your savings account on your paycheck and then worry about how to live off the rest. It's the same concept. It's like I'm paying myself first with my time first thing in the morning, so I can do the things that I need to do. And then, the rest of the day typically gets out of control. And then the other major component I would mention in answer to that is I try to marry as many of those activities into singular time commitments as I can, right? And so if I'm going to be doing a trip, I'll look at this both ways. Let's say that there's a trip that I really want to do. I will spend some time thinking about, like, okay, well, what videos actually would come out of that trip. Um, and then I will, write the scripts, the talkovers, the voiceovers for those things. And inevitably, I'll get it slightly wrong, and I might have to come back and revise it. But by writing a script, that allows me to write a shot list, and so now I know what shots I want to make and get. And so then when I go out and I do the trip, I almost always be carrying around basically what's a map fold, but it's got a shot list in it, and I'll kind of go through my shot list and make sure that I'm ticking all the boxes and getting the shots that I want, as just sort of part of the flow of the trip, and so that the trip becomes part of the shooting environment. But then there's this inverted world where I have an idea for a video and then I need to find a trip for it. In some ways, that's easier to plan because I can take the same workflow and like write a script and do a shot list and then figure out what a good location would be to go do that, and then get those shots and that kind of thing. So I try to do that as much as possible. Now I certainly take trips that I like don't even shoot at all, because I think balance in all things. Like, I don't always want to be looking at the world through a camera lens. I think there's real value in being present, and and I already give up enough of that. I'm not saying that I'm good about that, because it is the nature of being someone who creates YouTube videos on a weekly basis. I spend a lot of time looking at the world through the camera lens rather than just looking at the world. But because I'm cognizant of that, I try to consciously take trips where I go, I'm not filming. I'm just going, and I'm just doing the trip. And so that's sort of how I try to do all that stuff. My work, I'm lucky to work in a remote job. I'm lucky to be in sort of leadership levels where I can, to degrees, dictate my own hours. It's a very salary type deliverable based business I'm in. I have a team of analysts, and so we have to get ad hoc and reported analytics out the door, and it doesn't matter when you get that done, as long as you get it done by your deadline. And so I can kind of flex my hours around a little bit. And like right now I'm on my lunch hour, just doing this video. So that's sort of how that fits in. I have to take vacations for big trips, just like anyone who would have a regular, I would say 9-to-5 job in America. That's not really a thing. It's like you either have an hourly paid job or you work, these salaried things where you need to be kind of on call from 8 to 6, kind of thing. Doesn't mean that you work from 8 to 6, but you have to be available. And so I have one of those jobs. And so I take time off when I need to, like when we went to hike the Tour de Mont Blanc, that was a 3-week vacation, right? Scheduled as a vacation time. Yeah. So I don't know. I hope that answers your question, Vincent. I know that was one of yours. Let's see what else we got here. We got another question about ice climbing progression, ice axes. Okay, I'll come to those in a second. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, you guys are seeing the flashes in the screen. Oh no, you're talking about the ice tools. Got it. No screen. Yeah, no, I don't know what it is. It's gonna suck for whoever has to watch this later. I'll try and figure it out, but I can't go replace my my webcam in the middle of this. So I'm sorry, you guys are seeing the little zip flashes across the screen. Okay, so we'll come back to ice climbing in a minute. So the toughest challenge is when including kids in these activities. It's both a challenge and an opportunity. The reality is, I think I'm pretty candid about the fact that I'm very knowledgeable, but I am not a guide. I'm not AMGA. I'm certainly not IFMGA. I worked really hard to make sure that I know standard practices across those bodies of professionals, and really try to vet my work before I put stuff out there, so you guys are getting good information. But I try to be open about that. In fact, every video has a it has a description, and the next paragraph is videos can only do so much, go get qualified instruction. I really respect those professions. I try to learn a lot from those professions. But the biggest challenge is when I'm out with my kids, my mentality is I'm not their dad, I'm a guide. Because it's really the same dynamic. Like if you're a guide, and I've worked with guides a lot. That's part of why I know what I know. Is when I was getting ready to try a first ascent in the Himalaya, I spent 2 years working monthly, sometimes bi-weekly, depending on what time of year, with a guide more on like instructional stuff, like teaching me all the little nuances and tips and tricks and, advanced level stuff. Um, I respect what it is that they do, and I think the mentality is the same. That if it hit the fan, if something bad happened, like my kids are, don't get me wrong, they're capable, but they're kids, and in that way, it's sort of the same as any like novice climber. Is that if a guide gets into trouble, they can't rely on the novice climber to get them and the team out of it. And so I have to be competent enough to not only get myself out of the situation, but get this team of three, or if my wife's with us, a team of four, out of the situation. So I think the biggest complicating factor of doing this with kids is that, um, I have to think about it that way, and that there's a whole set of residual impacts from that. Like, it's got to be stuff that I know is within my ability. Like you'll hear guides talk about like their biggest impediment to pushing their climbing grades is the fact that they're always climbing within their ability, and you can't push your grades if you're not willing to take falls. But as a guide, like you can't take a fall if you don't know the person who's holding the other end of the rope. Like, sure, it seems like they know what they're doing, but and like I trust my kids a lot more than that guide does. But it's the same sort of dynamic, right? Like if I can't put the rope up, although that's about to change on rock, my kids are getting good enough that they're going to climb better than me. But if I can't put the rope up, we're not doing anything that day. So everything is within my capabilities. And so residual impact of that is like, I don't improve that much. Like I have to go find ways consciously to try and improve and push my abilities. That's a residual. Another residual is that like, I have to know, team rescue, not just self-rescue. And so I need to really practice those skills a lot. There's a whole bunch of stuff, like the way that I show up psychologically to climb with my kids, coming at it from this place of like, it's one thing for us to select these risks for ourselves, but my 10-year-olds, while certainly, bright and able to think about risk and like, I think they're advanced for 10-year-olds in that way. Like the idea to pretend and absolve myself of moral responsibility of the reality that I'm selecting these risks for them, I think is very real. And so, as soon as you're doing that, as soon as you're making risk choices for someone else, you really need to treat that circumstance very, very seriously. And you got to know what the heck you're doing. Not for when everything goes right, but for when everything goes wrong. Like the nightmare scenario for me isn't one of my kids gets hurt. That would suck, and it would be emotional and it'd be difficult to deal with. But the nightmare scenario is I get hurt, because then now they're dealing with the psychological trauma of trying to get us out of a situation if I'm incapacitated. And so trying to avoid that type of environment is probably the biggest thing that comes with bringing my kids out. But that's the hard part. The question doesn't ask like the good stuff, and maybe this gets into the next part, like what am I learning? And the question specifically asks like not just what are you learning technically, but what am I learning about myself and big think ideas. Getting my kids out here, it's recentering me in a sense of joy. The joy, like one of the great things about becoming a parent, if you're willing to open yourself up to it, and I can't say that I did this right away, but I learned to do it pretty fast, and I'm thankful for that, is that your kids see everything, everything's new, everything's for the first time, like their first snow. Just stop and think about that for a second. Like try and empathize with a 9-month-old being, sitting there and looking at crystalline structures that are falling from the sky that are cold, but they don't weigh anything. And how is that possible? But when they get together, they weigh a lot, and they don't hurt when they hit me, but I can ball it up and then it becomes hard. Like that's freaking amazing. If you think about it, it's just amazing. And so being able to bring that wonder back into my life of just like, forget fantasy, like, I like Star Wars and Indiana Jones and, those types of, Tolkien and fantasy stuff too. But the real world is flipping amazing. And just being able to step back and take in just how amazing that is. Because every time they learn something new, and sort of what the whole channel is about is like every time I teach them something, I'm kind of generally making a video about it. They're learning these new things. And every time they learn something new, it rekindles that sense of wonder. And if I'm willing to grab onto that, I think that's one of the biggest benefits. The other major benefit about doing this is like when I grew up, I was born in 77, right? And we would take family vacations, sort of like pre VHS recorder, which came around in the late 80s, these old 8mm film cameras, right? And we'd go out to a national park and my dad would film a little bit. He wasn't like me, he'd film every, a couple seconds here and there kind of thing. But that would get quote unquote made into a home movie. And those home movies would get stored in the top of some closet somewhere. And you might look at them once the rest of your life, right? One of the other major benefits of this is every time we go out, because we're making multiple videos about it, we're kind of looking at the footage again together. And that allows us to sort of not only have the experience together, but have the relived experience together, which is another form of sharing. And I really enjoy that. I enjoy, them catching a glimpse of themselves on the screen and going, yeah, I remember that. That's cool. Oh, did you get a shot of me doing this, Dad? That type of relived. So now I get to have that joy twice. So I really like that. So yeah, hopefully that answers that, that question about, what else am I learning? So sort of the seriousness of it and the ethical responsibilities that come around it, but then also just taking the opportunity to find joy in climbing. And, I've sort of accepted my mediocrity. And so I'm not out there like beating myself up and going like, well, you're never going to be a 514 climber, and 514 isn't even like that elite anymore, and well, okay. Right. I do stuff that's hard for me, trying a first ascent in the Himalaya, I think is just sort of objectively hard, but it's not, I'm not doing David Lama's version of trying to do first ascents in the Himalayas. I was never going to be as good as he was. But it's hard for me. And I like going places where the opportunity of success is, not near 100%, where I'm likely to fail. And so I can push myself on a climb on an M7 that people would laugh at, go, M7, I'd do that in my sleep, right? I could do it with one tool. Well, cool. You're a better climber than me, at that type of climbing, right? And so where I try and offset, sort of my limitations is that I try to get in and out of systems really fast, which is part of why my channel is the way that it is, right? Is that, I can't make up time through climbing super silkenly up vertical things. Like I can do it, but I'm just not going to do it fast because I'm not good enough. I'm not fit enough. I'm not, all those things. But what I can do is when I get to the top of that thing and it's time to, get the other person up and then transition, I can get in and out of that system in a hurry. And so that's where I try to there's two different ways of looking at performance, and they both are important. One is to identify your weaknesses and work on them, but the other is identify your strengths and lean into them. And so I try to find that balance. Like, yeah, I do my workouts. I try to get stronger at the things that I'm weak at. I try to work on technical climbing moves that I'm not good at. So I do spend time working on my weaknesses, but I'm also aware of my strengths and I try to lean into those strengths in order to offset some of my weaknesses. So that's another big takeaway, right? My kids are a mirror of that. I'm helping them both as a coach and as a sort of a guide instructor learn things. And so I have to be aware of their strengths and weaknesses too. So, all right. So that was it for the pre-can questions. We've got some other stuff here. Let me see. I went through, talked about uphill athlete. Yeah, I'll go to the next one, Vincent, about what inspired me to start this channel. I mentioned it a little bit in a video I've done. That's more like just about me. I've only really done one video that's just about me. It's in my Mental Health Awareness Month series, by the way, which is every May in the United States is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so every May I spend the time on like psychology of climbing. And that can be personal, or it could be like, it's good to have everyone in an accident working to the peak of their abilities because it reduces PTSD. And here's the psychological study that proves that. And so it could be that, but it's in that series, that playlist, if you want to go look at it. But I started it because my kids asked. I actually didn't want to do it. Connor started asking me first. He's like, you should do a YouTube channel. Because this was like, early pandemic stuff. And so they were probably spending more time in front of screens than they should have, to be honest. And YouTube was like a thing to them. And, it's like, well, that wouldn't be cool if we could do YouTube. And so he asked me, and I was like, no, I don't want to do it. And then eventually he recruited his brother, Cade, and they both were starting to ask me. And that got harder to push back on, because when your kids want something, you kind of want to do it for them if you can. But I was worried about like putting their faces on camera and exposing our family to, the vitriol that comes out of social media and all those types of things that, still happen. But, they eventually kind of came up with the concept. They were like, you have to teach us all this stuff, Dad, and you should film it and then put it up there. And maybe it'll help other families, because now we're in the pandemic, and maybe it'll help other families because outside was a safe place. So it's like, well, maybe it'll help other families get outside. Right. And well, okay, that's reasonable. And so actually the very first videos I ever did were about snowshoeing, because it was the winter of 2020. The pandemic had just hit American shores. And, everyone's trying to figure out how to not go crazy living inside of their house. And I was like, well, snowshoeing's low barrier to entry. Like, you can rent snowshoes. And if you were going to buy them, they don't have to be expensive. And you've probably got warm clothes anyways, even if they're not, outdoor clothing. And it's mostly walking. Yeah, there's some actual technique to it, but it's mostly walking. So I did a series of videos about snowshoeing. It's like, hey, you guys are locked inside. Try snowshoeing. Maybe it gets you out because it's the middle of winter and no one wants to be out there. And here's a way to do it that maybe is more comfortable. So that was really the genesis of it. And now it's just advancing. The techniques are getting more and more advanced. The systems that we're building are getting more and more advanced, only because my kids are getting more and more advanced. So if you went back in time, you're going to find more beginner stuff. And now we're sort of in that intermediate to slightly advanced when it comes to systems thinking, not necessarily when climbing. We're sort of like firmly in the intermediate as climbers, I would say. But you'll just see it gets more complicated because the kids are mastering the basics and they're needing to learn the next level of stuff. And so that's what's happening, really. So that's how I started the channel. Let's see. In terms of ice climbing progression, how do you manage risk versus difficulty? Came to ice from rock climbing, and I find physically aspect easy. Yeah, that's not surprising. Managing exposure on big vertical ice is a puzzle. I'll talk about specific and then just sort of generically. Specifically, I don't have any reason to second guess, really important ice climbers like Will Gadd, who talks about this constantly. He talks about ice climbing is still a do not fall sport. We know that dry tooling isn't, particularly because, really advanced dry tooling is getting so hard that it's overhanging and it's in caves. If you think about that, you're falling into space. So that's a relatively safe fall. We know that hard rock climbing, particularly sport climbing, is no longer a no-fall zone. It's how you push your grades, is you be willing to try moves that are hard. But the thing that's different about ice climbing, if it's truly ice climbing, not dry tooling, sort of then by definition, it's not overhanging, because ice can't really grow. It can a little bit, but once you get like severe overhanging, it can't, right? It becomes a pillar. So you're pretty much on vertical when it comes to hard ice. And in that world with sharp things over your head and sharp things on your feet, if you take a fall, your ice screws are designed to keep you from not dying, not decking. They can't stop you from getting hurt the same way that rock protection sometimes can, because the environment itself isn't difficult. If you fall and you catch a crampon point and you fall, it grabs the ice, it turns your foot as you fall past it, you will break your ankle, right? If you fall with a sharp thing over your head and, you spin out and so you're facing up, it can hit you in the face, right? I've stabbed myself in the thigh with ice tools. The falls in ice climbing are far more consequential. And so I still treat it, and again, Will Gadd still treats it, and he's better than I will ever be, as a no-fall zone for that reason. And so, thinking about progressing ice climbing difficulty in terms of risk, one is, doing your time following as you push. Just following grades becomes more important because now you're falling on top rope. Your lead climbers up there belaying you. And so just getting used to knowing you have the physical capabilities and the technique to not get pumped out as you get into harder and harder grades, and doing that in a top roped environment. I think that's an important way to go. And then the other thing I would say about it, sort of more generally is I think of my risks sort of bimodally, because when I take a risk, I take a big risk. Like, I go to the Himalaya and try an unclimbed peak. I'm, right now in the planning stages of, maybe the Karakoram this coming summer. Don't know yet if that's going to happen, but and that would probably be another FA attempt. And so I'm going into, by definition, unknown places where the risks, if they're not known, become harder to mitigate. So that's a big risk. And so because I spend time taking a big risk, I try and balance that on the other side of the risk distribution, where I spend a lot of time taking very small risks. So like I don't trad climb a lot. I trad climb, but I don't trad climb at the crag. Like I'll trad climb in the Alpine environment because sort of by definition, that's always going to be trad. And I like being in the mountains more than I like cragging. But if I'm going to crag, I might as well go sport climb, because now I'm reducing that risk even more. And it's more about the physical movement now than it is, and the puzzle solving of the physical movement, than it is about, placing the gear. And that's not to say that, trad climbers who do really hard trad climbs shouldn't. I'm not saying that at all. It's just because that's part of where they take their risk. I'm doing a 14D trad climb. That's really flippin' risky, right? I can't do that. These elite climbers, like that's where they take, that's their equivalent of going to the FA in the Himalaya. And so how many times do they do that versus how many times do they just work on getting strong? And so I tend to do a lot of sport climbing on one hand, and then I have these big trips where the risks are outsized on the other, because it's probability times consequence. So if the consequence is really high, I'm going to reduce the probability by not taking that many trips. And if the consequence is really low, a sport climbing environment, I can inflate that time so that, that risk sort of tends to balance out. And so I don't spend a lot of time in the middle areas of risky climbing. I tend to either go kind of like really big risk or a lot of really small risk. And that's just my approach to it. And I did a video, again, this one would be in that Mental Health Awareness Month series. I think it's called something like, what is risk rationing and how can it help climbers? And that's what I'm talking about. Like, how do you ration your risks? I'm not saying don't take risks, just how do you think about the law of large numbers and fit that highly risky stuff, the highly consequential stuff, into a smaller set of numbers, because eventually probability catches up with all of us. So that's sort of the bigger picture. There's the ice climbing specifically, but then sort of the bigger picture. So if you're doing difficult leads as a part of your progression of ice climbing, you've done a pillar ice WI5, followed it a bunch of times, you're feeling good, you have the fitness, you're going to go try and lead it. For you, that's a big risk. And so think about how many times you want to do that year before you shift over and do some lower risk stuff. Balance frequency is my advice. Okay. Need to pick up a pair of ice axes that would cover more technical climbing in Scotland and basic ice climbs. Is there a good set? It depends how much you want to spend. Elite Climb, which is a Polish company that makes carbon fiber tools. I was talking about, I have the Morphos. I have another set. I think they're called the Salamandras. And they're kind of equivalent to the Petzl Quark in terms of how much curve they have. And they have more of a spike, less technical grip. So it's a straighter grip with just a pinky pommel at the bottom, which means you can plunge it in the snow. And that's part of what you're looking for, right? Is that if you're doing a combination of like, low angle snow and then some ice and some mixed, well, what do you need? Well, you need an axe that doesn't have a really ergonomic handle, because that'll stop you from plunging it in the snow for the snow part. You need some curve in order to handle the technical components. You definitely need an inverted pick for the ice section. So you have a pick that goes like this, a convex pick bend. That's for snow, and it's bent downwards purposely for self-arrest. You have an inverted pick, a concave pick. That's in order to get the beak of that pick pointed more forward, so that when you throw it into the ice, it can actually penetrate the ice. And so you're trying to find a balance point between all of those. I think the Petzl Quark makes a good tool for that reason. It's going to be heavier. It's going to be cheaper. It's going to be metal, which means you're going to get that conductivity into your hands. If you want to spend the money for it, that carbon fiber Salamandra for Elite Climb is very, very equivalent. It's going to be lighter, though. It's going to be a hell of a lot more expensive. Your hands will be happier because of that lack of conductivity. And it's not so aggressive that you can't climb and that's the tool I turn to when I switch to elite climb stuff. I got the Morphos for vertical, and when I'm out with my kids, I'm climbing on those Salamandras on like WI3 for those tools. So that would be a couple of my recommendations. Yeah, Nomic. Nomic is slightly more aggressive than the Quark. If you think about, again, aggressiveness of the bend, the Quark's slightly less bent, the Nomic is more bent, and then you get to their Petzl's Ergos, which are the most bent, which is for vertical ice or dry tooling. So the Nomic's going to fit in that middle part. The difference is that the Nomic's going to have an ergonomic hand, which is going to make ice climbing a hell of a lot easier, but snow climbing a hell of a lot harder because you don't get that plunge into the snow. And then you can even go like more towards traditional ice axes. Petzl makes something called the Sumtech, which is more of a traditional ice axe. It's longer. It doesn't even have a handle on it. You can buy a pommel that you put on it that makes it a pinky palm. And the only difference is that it comes with an inverted pick. So it's got a very slight curve at the top of it only. So you can get a lot of shaft into the snow. And then you've got an inverted pick for ice climbing, and you can add a pommel that you can slide up and down the shaft. So if you're on snow, you can put it all the way at the top. So you can drop that. It operates like a traditional ice axe. And then if you need it as an ice tool for a little while, you can slide that pommel down, use it as a pinky rest, and then use it as a tool. So that would be like it's a hybrid is what they call it. I think Black Diamond's version of that is the Venom. So you can get these different hybrid tools. So the Quark, the Salamandras would fall squarely as ice tools, more ice tool than axe, but just enough axe. Whereas something like the Sumtech is going to be more axe than tool, just enough tool, if that makes sense. Vincent, have you done any other expeditions than Alaska? Enjoy the documentary. Yeah, I had an old channel that was really just trips called How Not. It's called Not One Thing, based on a quote from an article. It's actually a quote by Lionel Richie done in an article in the Rolling Stone and the 1980s pop artist Lionel Richie. And the question was, what did you learn? You're at the top now. What did you learn? And Lionel Richie's response was, not what did you learn? What is at the top? And that's what he asked. What is at the top? And Lionel Richie said, not one thing. The only thing at the top is all the experiences you had to get there. So basically, like, it's devoid of its own meaning. It's the journey. And so I had an old channel called Not One Thing. You can see the Denali expedition on that channel. Done very poorly with point of view cameras, which I know you see some of that now when I'm in rock climbing environments. It's hard for me to set up cameras, but I hate POV. I do it when I have to because it's shaky and all sorts of stuff that I think it makes it hard to watch. Have I done any other expeditions? Yeah, I've been to South America, climbed a lot in Ecuador before I went to Alaska. I've done a lot of stuff in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, which is the only glaciated part of mountains, the Cascade mountain range in the United States. Also in British Columbia, but I haven't really done British Columbia side of that. Been to Alaska, did this trip right before the pandemic where we made an attempt in the Annapurna Massif of the Himalayan range. We did not make it, but it was an FA. Like again, I like to do things that I might not be able to do. And so I knew I might not be able to do it. I do unguided stuff, although this trip in the Karakoram, I might actually do guided, but not like commercial guided, not like they're in front of us setting camps and dropping fixed lines and we just jug our way up. It's very much going to be a team. Like, we'll help fix ropes, all that type of stuff. But this person knows that area. And one of the things that I learned about my FA attempt in 2019 was how much that matters, like being able to know the area and read the snow and all that type of stuff. So I might have a guide for this one, but hopefully it'd be much more of a partnership than a drag your ass up the mountain, which is not my style. And I tend to want to do things where no one else is around. So even when we went to Alaska, we did the West Rib Cutoff, which is the standard route up to 14 camp. And so we were there with 500 of our closest friends. Denali gets about 1,000 climbs a year. So about half of them are there at the same time we were. But then we broke off and we went and we grabbed the West Rib and we were the only people there. And that's how I like to climb. I want to be self-sufficient. I don't want to put other people at risk. I'll take these risks myself, but I don't want to put other people at risk. And so being off and self-sufficient is part of my ethos around it. And so hopefully this will end up being something like that. So those are the big expeditions. Some of the stuff in the Cascades you wouldn't really call big, but they're big-ish. It's glaciated terrain. It's multi-day. Certainly the extended trips in South America were big. Alaska was my first attempt at like the conscious thought was like, I just need to experience sitting on the side of a mountain for 3 weeks and see if I like it. Do I still enjoy this? And so that was what Alaska was about. And when I came back saying, yeah, I still like this, that's when the Himalayan trip started to get put together. I went to Denali in 2015. I went to the Himalaya in 2019. It took that long just to put together a team because I'm going unguided, because it's not a commercial trip, because it's the middle of nowhere, and trying to convince a bunch of like-minded amateurs, that like, hey, are you willing to put in this amount of money and this amount of time for this thing that you probably have a 30% chance of doing? It's hard to find that person. And so I went through a lot of different iterations of putting together a team that eventually stuck and made it an attempt. And we didn't get the summit, but I learned a lot. And so I'll try another one here. Unfortunately, I have to leave. Well, thanks for coming, Pedro. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. I'll keep going as long as people are willing to tolerate. I mean, I do have got to get back to work here at some point, but I'm on my way to the High Atlas in Morocco. Cool. Search for uncharted alpine ice. You have any advice? I don't know how much this is generalizable to finding unclimbed routes. Maybe you can tell me with another follow-up chat in the comment, but I'll tell you what I've learned about trying to find unclimbed peaks, that there's basically 3 types of unclimbed peaks. One is it's just really hard to get to it. It's just logistical. It is in the middle of nowhere. There are like no roads, and you got to, bushwhack through country and whatever. And so people don't go there because it's just too damn hard. Then there's like, the kind of stuff that like, David Lama and Annapurna 3 attempts when it was unclimbed and those types of things, like the professional alpinists go for. They're looking for those technical challenges. They're looking for lines on mountains. And sure, like some of that is just no one's climbed the east face, but someone summited through the quote unquote standard route. Some is that, but there's also the unclimbed, like this mountain's just hard. And so then there's like what the pros are going for. And then there's the type of stuff that I can do. Cause like I can't take a 90-day trip to go, when you start talking about acclimatization schedules and stuff too, to get in and out of that really hard peak. So I can't do that. And I'm not good enough to do the Annapurna 3. So then there's this third category. You find massifs that really hard peak. I was on the Annapurna Massif. It wasn't the really hard peak. That was Annapurna 3, which was 2 peaks to my east. And then there's the Peak Bagger Peak, the highest, obviously Annapurna 1, which was 4 or 5 peaks to my west. And so what happened is all the peak baggers go get Annapurna 1 because they want to climb the 8,000ers or whatever it is. And all the super elite alpinists want to go get the technical challenge, the unsolved problem. And what's left is just like, it's not the highest and it's not the hardest. And so no one goes after it. And those are the kind of peaks that I can find. And so if that's generalizable to a route, you're trying to find like, it's not the highest, it's not the hardest. For routes, it'd probably be, it's not the hardest. And then there's, I think when it comes to routes, ice would be less, but rock certainly would be the case. How much work are you willing to put in, right? Because a lot of what you'll find is like, the rock equivalent of it's too hard to get to. It's just on the face. It's too chossy. So how much time are you willing to spend cleaning? How much time you're willing to put in the work of, bushwhacking that trail and setting up the landing area and cleaning the rock and scrubbing the lichen and, all those types of things. If you're willing to do that work, then, you're going to be able to put up FAs. On ice, I make up that it's about finding the stuff that's ephemeral. It's the stuff that's not there every year. You hear the rumor of, yeah, there's this classic test piece over here, but every decade or so, this other thing next to it comes in. We haven't seen it though for a long time. Or you can look for feature changes. Geological time means now. I live near Rocky Mountain National Park. We just had, there's a place, there's a glacially carved, chasm between these 2 lines of peaks, and the whole east side calved in like 2 years ago. And so rock climbs that used to be there and known and put in guidebooks aren't there anymore. That includes the ice climbs that used to be there and known. Now they're different. So anyone who's going to go do that, they're going to be putting up FAs. And so the other thing you could look for is like feature changes where what used to be there yesterday is not there tomorrow. And you got to give that time, enough time to stabilize because you're kind of by definition going into a risky environment. But if you give that time to stabilize, you're going to find, new lines that no one's put up because like the mountain literally never looked like that before. So, there's little to no info on ice climbs in Morocco. But I know some of that stuff is out there. Alpine journals. You want to find what countries have had kind of parades of their countrymen going to that area because they tend to go in spurts, right? Like if you look near, again, by analogy, I'm not talking about Morocco, but by analogy, if you look near Lukla, which is that famous airport in Nepal where people fly into before they do the trek up into Everest. There was a time in the 1960s where Japanese climbers were flocking to that area and climbing all the mountains kind of right around Lukla, which includes some 6,900 meter peaks. And what it took was a team to come there and do a reconnaissance mission and scout around, and they would come back and write it up. And then another team would come and they'd make an attempt and maybe they wouldn't do it. And then a team would come and have some success. And then that would open the floodgates. And then you have a bunch of Japanese climbers coming from different teams, year after year after year to roughly the same area because they're developing tribal knowledge within their own climbing community. You think about going to their Alpine club meetings and talking to each other and that kind of thing. So they're developing tribal knowledge around that area. And so they'll attract climbers and countrymen to that same area. And so you want to find some of the seminal climbs in Morocco, even if there's very little, there will be a couple that oh yeah, this is one of the known climbs. Find out when that was climbed. Find out by what country of people, because they tend to climb with people of the same country. That's going to be less and less now as the world gets smaller, but certainly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up until very recently, people tend to climb with only people from their country because that's who they would know and meet. Find when people came to that area, read the Alpine journals that are printed by that country's Alpine club, and you'll start to see what's been climbed, what's been attempted, what hasn't. Then follow the rabbit trail. You'll find a route that, or a peak or whatever it is that was attempted but not done. And then now start Google searching for, that specific peak or that specific route. And you'll run into some dead ends and you'll find out, yeah, that actually was climbed. And, okay, so it's not an FA anymore. But you'll find places where it just leads nowhere. And if it leads nowhere, then the last step is to put it out into the climbing community saying hey, I'm going to do this thing. I wouldn't do it until you've already done the trip because you don't want people to pirate your trip. If you really care about the FA, if you don't, go ahead. But if you really care about the FA, once you've got the logistics locked in and you're ready to go, put out those social media posts, talk to your local Alpine clubs, talk to the other Alpine clubs that you know about that have been in the area and just blast them and say, hey, I'm going to go do this thing. Has anyone done it? So if you lead to a dead end on the internet and you get no one coming back saying, yeah, I know that guy Joe who did that in 1973, then you've done your due diligence. And for all you know, it's an FA. And so then you couch it as such. And when you write it up, you couch it as such. So you say, hey, we did this thing and here's the description of the route and here's what it was like and here's how I would grade it and here's what I named it. And here's this, I checked these sources and I couldn't find anything. If anyone knows that I'm wrong and someone has done this, let me know. And then that's sort of like the ethic around it. All right. Anything else? Anything else people want to know about me or about climbing or about gear or about whatever? Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone. 5,000 subscribers. That's because of you, and particularly the dedicated you who'd show up to a live show in your evening, I imagine, because most of you are in Europe, except for our Quebec friend who's figuring out how to do this in the middle of the day. I appreciate you guys, following the channel. I appreciate the support. I will say one other thing on that front about how you can support. And no, I'm not about to ask you for money. Every once in a while, probably one of the more frequent about your channel questions I get is it seems like your channel is pretty good, Jason. How come it's so small? The reasons it's so small is because, maybe wrongly, I refuse to play the hyperbola game. Like maybe I'll do a post about this in the community tab on YouTube. I grabbed a screenshot. Like I'm releasing a video and I want to say like, you know, is the pinch better than the gree to go back to the thing that I was describing earlier, right? Like I will tend to write something like, here's what the pinch is good at, and better than the gree, but here's what the gree is better at than the pinch. And here's why I might choose one over the other for a specific climb. Or, you guys see me do this with techniques all the time. Here's this technique and here's this other technique. And this technique has these strengths and this one has those strengths, and they offset each other in terms of weaknesses. And so, I might choose this technique in these circumstances and this one and the other, but I'm not the person who like goes out and says, this technique's great and it's the only one, and this technique's bad and it's the only one that you should never use, and you're going to die if you do it. And I'll write a script, and I'll do a video, and then I'll do a headline, and the headline will be something like, when and why I might choose the pinch versus the gree. And what the AI channel enhancing software things that you can buy will tell me to do is say, put something like, expert climber talks about the only tool he'll ever use. And it's like, I don't know if I'm an expert. I'm an expert at some things, but in the continuum of climbers, I hesitate to say I'm freaking awesome. So I don't want to put expert in there. And then I'm never always do this, never do that guy. And because I think that's not how people stay safe. I think this is a nuanced sport, and risk assessment's super important, and risk assessment's all about trade-offs, and there's no like perfect solution to anything. It's all about what risks you choose a piece of gear because it'll help you not have to deal with these risks, but then it makes you confront these other risks. You choose technique because it avoids you having to deal with these risks, but then it makes you confront these other risks. So I don't do the hyperbolic stuff. And because I don't do the hyperbolic stuff, my stuff doesn't get pushed. It doesn't mean it doesn't get pushed zero. Again, I'm not going to be hyperbolic. Like I gain 4 or 5 subscribers every day, but I don't go viral because I don't put clickbait titles and I don't give clickbait advice. And so the only other way that this can get pushed is for you guys to share, and like push it out yourselves. Hey, this video is valuable to me. I have 4 climbing friends. I'm going to send it to them. So that might be the one thing I could ask. If you guys want to help the channel grow because you find it valuable, then maybe that, because I just do not want to go down the algorithm feeding machinations that you have to do. Not because I don't think I know how to do it, is because I honestly think it's pernicious. I get why people do it, but I'm talking about things where people die if they make mistakes. And so I do not want to feed into that, potentially have someone make a mistake because I make a hyperbolic statement. Only do this. I'm the most expert, so listen to my advice. I don't want to do that stuff. So you guys can help me by sharing widely. Share as much as you can. That'll help my channel grow because it'll become a word of mouth guerrilla thing rather than an algorithm thing. If you find that, you find something particularly useful, I'd appreciate that. So, but I wanted to say that because it's on the back of because of what I just described, this channel really is all about you. It's all about you, the people who watch. I'm trying to think about stuff that you would enjoy. Yes, I'm doing what my kids need to learn. And that's sort of the driving creative spur. But the reason why you don't know that much about me is because I'm tilting heavily towards the educational content and less towards the, who am I, cult of personality type thing. It's about you. It's about the audience. It's about you guys who are on this live chat right now. So I'm very appreciative of it. For me, who have to worry about being in large groups of people because I have cancer, and that means my immune system is suppressed, and that means I can't go into large groups without worrying about getting sick and stuff like that. This is how I exercise my outlet of education. I used to be an instructor at the Colorado Mountain Club, but I just can't be in large auditoriums with people anymore. So this is healing for me. And the fact that you are getting something out of it and are letting me do that healing, I really appreciate. So with that, we're almost at 90 minutes. Really appreciate it. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anyone's questions here in the channel, on the chat, I mean. Um, oh yeah, it's another, yeah, I feel you, Craig. It's Craig's in there talking about like, you know, views fluctuation. Yeah, no, I feel your pain. um, but yes, so mostly this was a thank you for hitting 5,000. And like I said, you know, I'm already at whatever 5,100 plus because I get 4 to 5 every day. So you know, you guys are helping. I hope you continue to help. I hope you continue to get more out of this. I think you see that I'm active in the chats as long as you're not being rude. And obviously, people here today aren't any of the people that are being rude. So if you have ideas of stuff you want to see, stuff you have questions about, stuff you want to try out, I'm usually pretty responsive about turning those into videos. Just know that I have to set my calendar, my video calendar well ahead of time so that I can plan those trips where I get the shots. So it's not like I can turn it around tomorrow, but you know, someone asked if I could do something on water. You're about to see something on water, you know, in the winter and how high altitude climbers deal with water because it can't be a camelback. It can't be a hose. You know, I'll turn ideas into videos if you guys have ideas. I'm always farming for stuff that you will find valuable. And there's no more certain way to find something that's valuable to you than for you to tell me it would be valuable if you made this video. So, so I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone who's a part of this. I appreciate everyone showing up today. I appreciate everyone showing up consistently over the life of the channel. You know, if you would share widely, I would appreciate that too. And I hope everyone now settling down to start thinking about bedtime in Europe has a good evening. And for those of you who are here in North America, hopefully your workday ends pretty soon as I get back to mine. Take care, everyone.